Erev Tov and welcome everyone. Today in school, my 4-year-old boy had something called the Aleph Bet ceremony, where they began learning about the Aleph Bet, and they do it by making the letters, the Hebrew letters, the Otiot, out of Play-Doh, and they have cookies, and it's the cutest thing in the world. Now, the letters that they make are the shapes that we're familiar with, that you could see here on the screen in the background, the ones that you have in your Siddur, and it's in every Siddur that has Hebrew, whether it's Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, doesn't even matter. Even Messianic Jews who are not Jews, or at least that it's not a Jewish denomination, everybody uses these Hebrew letters. And the Hebrew letters are incredibly important to our people in the mystical Kabbalistic tradition. The idea is that each letter that you see here on the page was created with the universe, or even the other way around. These letters were formed by God. When it said, God said, Vayhi or, let there be light, it wasn't just that God thought it. God literally used those letters, the Vav, the Yud, etc., and somehow those letters are intrinsically connected to the universe. And there are many mystical Kabbalistic works in which rabbis go through each of the Hebrew letters as we know them and say that each of the shapes of them has a power. And if one can master every curve, every dot, they can do something almost akin to magic, with the power of God. But these letters are sacrosanct. And if there's a book that's printed with the name of God, with the letters, the Yud, the Hey, the Vav, and the Hey, that book cannot be thrown away. It must be buried like a Hebrew, like a human being. So these letters are the most sacred, important core. Our Torah scrolls are written in, our prayer books, and our entire country of Israel that thank God we got back is based around this Hebrew alphabet, except this may not be the alphabet that we always had. So if these letters need to be perfect, every little curve of them for a Torah scroll to be kosher, what does it mean that the alphabet may have changed throughout time? And this class is so interesting, and we can only touch on the topic just because of time and the level of knowledge required. But this class is going to touch on history, archaeology, theology, ancient Jewish texts, and mystery. There's a lot of mystery to what's going on tonight. So I'm breaking the class into two parts. The first part of the class will be a crash course in what we know of the history of just the alphabet in general. And there are a lot of holes, because a lot of the records, as I'll mention in the class, of human beings in general, not just the Jews and the Israelites, a lot of records are gone. People used to write on ancient materials that just fell apart or buried underground or lost or destroyed. So much of this history, as I said, is a mystery, rhyme not intended. So the first part of the class will kind of go through a crash course in the history of the alphabet and how it connects to the Hebrew alphabet. And then the second part will actually look at some rabbinic sources, because this entire conversation is not a purely academic scholarly one. This conversation about the Hebrew alphabet and how it may have changed is discussed in the Talmud. And there's no resolution today. You probably have some Jews who say, no, it was absolutely this way. Some who say it was absolutely this way. And the truth might be somewhere in the middle. So before we actually get into the presentation, are there any questions up until now? And those who just joined, welcome. Excellent. So let's go ahead and jump in. So the first slide here is just a general history about the idea of writing down words and letters. And again, there's so much more that can be said about this, because language came long before writing it down. People communicated with each other long before anything was written down. But the earliest historical proof we have for the idea of an alphabet, not the alphabet we know, but the idea of the alphabet that we have today, maybe not even the earliest form of communication, but the earliest form of the idea of the alphabet we think of is the Egyptian one. And around the year 3300 BCE, which is at least 1,000 or 2,000 years before the giving of the Torah, which we'll come back to. But the Egyptians, they had a language. They talked about birds and trees and money and how much money you owe me and how much I bought at the store, and you needed receipts. That's probably the history of the written, the history of writing in general probably connects a lot to writing down how much people owe each other, keeping legal records for tax purposes. But regardless, the Egyptians developed hieroglyphics, and these images would tell a story. A great king fought a war, won, etc. That's the only, they're not going to write down when they lose. And people could read that, they could interpret it and read it out. Now, whether each of these symbols originally meant a letter, a lot of that we're not sure about, but regardless, the idea of an alphabet is about this old. Now we're going to jump forward a little bit in history. The idea of the alphabet as a formal system of letters, meaning like an A, B, C, D, E, and then you move them around to write words. The oldest version we have of that is probably from the 17th or 16th century. This tablet they call the Serabit Curse, and it's not the Hebrew alphabet. But what happened is hieroglyphics, which were again more of telling a story through pictures, almost like a children's book. Eventually, those pictures came from, I want to talk about a war, so I'll draw man, sword, and dead guy. Everybody knows what that is. But at some point in history, that turned into man. And when I see that, I know it's Adam, or whatever it is in the Egyptian, Khawaja or something, or it's modern Egyptian or Arabic. But whatever it is, it eventually turned into, they weren't just symbols, pictures of things, they became sounds. And then you could move those written letters around to make new words. And you see some interesting things here. If you look at the word where it says consonant, to the left of it, are these squiggly lines. No one's unmuted right now, but essentially that's supposed to look like water. And in one of the earliest alphabets, that would have been M for mine. We'll come back to that. But all of these letters both had a sound and they were connected to an original word. So the earliest letters, the earliest alphabet, the letters looked like they looked like what the sound meant. For example, the word bet looked like a house for the word bite. Again, we'll come back to that, but there was a long history, a transition, where the pictures of words and what they meant slowly morphed into letters that were unconnected. For example, today, when you see the letter C, you don't think of, the big C out there. It's a totally different letter. Today, the letters have no meaning on their own. Back then, they both had a meaning and they had a sound. So I'm actually going to pause there for a moment because that's an important transition that we know a lot about, and there's still a lot of mysteries. Again, they were just pictures that people knew what they meant, and eventually those pictures started taking on sounds, and you could move them around and make new words. So questions up until now. Susan, go ahead.
How old is the Chinese writing system?
That's a great question. So that alphabet is unconnected or not connected to this alphabet, meaning it developed independently. There's no proof that I'm familiar with that they would have influenced each other. We do know that there are some things in the ancient world where the East did meet with the West, or the Far East with the Middle East. But in terms of the alphabet, I don't believe there's any connection there. So even if the Chinese alphabet was 1,000 years older, that doesn't necessarily mean it had any direct influence on this alphabet. So again, if someone wants to Google how old is the Chinese alphabet, it'd be interesting. But what we're really concerned about is the Egyptian alphabet, and then the Phoenicians that we'll get to in just a moment. Interesting question.
I'm just wondering if the Egyptian alphabet was older than the Chinese. I know there's no connection with.
Well, and that's also one of the things you just said is also one of the interesting things. Did the Egyptians think of their hieroglyphs, their pictures, as an alphabet? And originally probably not. It only became an alphabet sometime later. And by the way, this thing, we're talking 3300 BCE. Now this is 17th or 16th century before the Common Era. So, over 1,000 years later, means that this alphabet was even older than this. So there's a lot of things in history where archaeologists say, I found something in the year 5. I found a book written about the history of Rabbi Dinan in the year, 2021. Well, if it was written in 2021, then Rabbi Dinan must have been around having his adventures earlier than that. So that's why it's really hard to date things precisely for the rest of the class. Just because we have an alphabet written down in a certain year, it could have been a few hundred years old at that point. Very interesting. Again, if someone wants to Google it, it's a very interesting question, but it's not directly connected here. So this is one of the things that I wanted to point out because it's so fascinating. At some point in history, you have a word in ancient tongues of aleph or ox, and the animal, the ox, was like a symbol of strength. So for them, their gods, their kings were the aleph, the alpha. We talk about the alpha and the omega. So if you want to talk either about an actual ox or about a god, you'll draw a picture of an ox, and everyone knows you're talking about either the most powerful one or a god. And the word for that is some variation aleph or alpha. But as you can see, at some point, that letter, which see here, just looks like literally this in the top left corner, looks like an oxen head, became just a letter. And you could use it in different sentences, and it might totally lose its meaning. But originally, all of the letters were somehow connected to the original meaning. A dalet was a tent, and it looked like it. A hey was a person praising. And what's cool is in Hebrew, the word for praise is hallel, starts with a hey. So lots of cool, we'll come back to those things, and that's not true of everything, but we'll come back to it. This is what I was going to say, is that this is not true of every word in Hebrew, but it's very likely that certain words, as you can see here, the word El means Lord or God. It can literally mean a human, like a lord of a castle, or it can mean our God, like the God, or it can just mean a God, like not a real God. But the letters Aleph and Lamed, Aleph meaning like God or leader, and Lamed meaning like strength. So strong, Aleph Lamed is strong leader. Aleph Bet means strong, strength of the Bet, the bayit, the house. So again, this is not true of every single Hebrew letter, but the original shape of the letters and their meaning influence what the letters actually looked like. But the words existed before the letters. So there's a long history where people were talking, and the words that they spoke influenced the letters that they would write, which just makes things more complicated. So any questions up until now? Excellent. So this now, oh yes, Gloria, just unmuting you. Go ahead on your side. Beautiful. Yeah, go ahead.
Say that the Chinese alphabet is about 5,000 years old.
5,000. Okay, so but from now, meaning it probably started. It could have actually, maybe it's even a little bit younger then, because the Egyptian hieroglyphic alphabet, as we would describe it, is closer to like 5,300 years old. But again, the idea of an alphabet like that, 17th, 16th century, that's much younger than the Chinese alphabet. But again, were they aware of each other? Unlikely, but maybe some, there was an idea out there, other civilizations far away are writing down letters so they can make records of, again, probably business dealings, and then eventually religious texts and shopping lists, et cetera, like that. We have a lot of old pottery where someone writes down what they bought at the market, so they could keep track of it. So before we go on to where the Hebrew alphabet starts to come into play, there's a big question about when the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moshe, were written down. Now, if you ask academic scholars, they're going to give you very different dates. And the truth is, even with their academic scholarly dates, it doesn't necessarily change the rest of our class. The age of the Hebrew alphabet, as we know it, is not really influenced by when the actual Torah was written down. There's a question, was the Torah written down when Moshe got it at Har Sinai? Was it given over orally and written down 1,000 years later? Or was it written down at Har Sinai? Or was it given to Moshe at Har Sinai and then he spent the next 40 years writing it down? All of these different theories and hypotheses are mixing around, but the classical rabbinic understanding, which is totally a valid possibility, I mean, it's what I believe, but regardless, is in about the year 1312 BCE. And remember, so this is the 14th century before the year 0. And we know that in the 17th century, about 200 or 300 years before this, they had an alphabet. They had an alphabet that we'll talk about what that alphabet was, but there was an alphabet before the Torah was given, and it had been around for a couple hundred years. So that's where we're starting here. Now, the earliest form of what we would consider the alphabet of the Israelites, meaning there's lots of evidence that the Israelites were using this alphabet all over the place. They used it in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash. They used it in their private homes. There's ample archaeological evidence that this is the alphabet of the early Israelites. The earliest version is about the year 1000 before the Common Era. So this written down is about 300 years after the giving of the Torah. Now that has nothing to do about when the Torah was written. What's important is 1700 years before the year 0, we have this early alphabet. We'll call it the Phoenician alphabet. 1,000 years before the year 0, we have what we would call this Israelite or Paleo-Hebrew alphabet. And the Torah was written somewhere in there, which means that the letters that would have been written on the Torah would have been some version of either this alphabet right in front of us, and this is all the 22 letters of the alphabet, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, all the way through Taf, and they look much more like that ancient alphabet from the 17th century before the Common Era with funny letters. We'll look at a chart that shows what those letters look like. But again, the letters of Hebrew that we know today weren't really around at this point. So the only alphabets available to the Israelites were these alphabets. So if they were going to write the Torah in any alphabet, it would be probably this one that we have right in front of us, which means that the alphabet, so the Canaanites, you have this top line, this is what their alphabet looked like, which looks a lot like hieroglyphics. But the alphabet that we have from the year 1000 before the Common Era and from plenty of other shards and pottery of the ancient Israelites look like that middle line. So there is all evidence points to, and we'll come back to even more explicit evidence of what I'm saying here, that the alphabet or the Torah that Moshe would have brought down from Har Sinai, the tablets, the luchot habrit, the tablets of the covenant, the 10 commandments, would have been written in the letters of that middle line. And some of you may recognize some of those letters, and they may seem completely and totally foreign. Now, the Israelites, who obviously they were enslaved in Egypt, then they were in Canaan, they were influenced by other cultures around them. And the most popular alphabet at the time was called the Phoenician alphabet. And if you can read the Phoenician alphabet, you can read ancient Paleo-Hebrew. So the alphabet that the Israelites had was the Phoenician alphabet that a lot of other cultures had at the time. And again, we have so many written records and again, shards where the Israelites around the first temple were writing in that middle line. But the problem is, when anyone writes a Torah scroll today, they don't use those letters anymore. They use the bottom line or a fancier version of that. We'll come back to those phrases at the side, Ktav Ivri, leading the Hebrew writing, or Ktav Ashuri, this Assyrian writing. But all evidence points to the Torah, the alphabet that was available to the Israelites, that we know they were using for everything else, including calendars, a famous calendar called the Gezer calendar. They were using that middle line. So why wouldn't they be writing the Torah in that script? So questions up until now. Yeah, Shelly, you just got to click unmute on your side. I'll let you know when we could. Yeah, go ahead, please.
So just a question, when do they, I just kind of get me in the right history frame.
Yeah.
When were things not written in stone or carved into stone? When was there evidence that there was some kind of whether it was on animal skin or something like that? Do you know when that took place? Just so.
Are you talking about like when we start getting like scrolls, as it were, in animal skins?
Well, maybe, or just when, I mean, because what you were talking about, what you've been talking about all along are things they found stones, and written in stone. So I just wondered when the first evidence of writing on something that was not carved into a stone.
No, it's a great question. So here's the issue with that. The writing on animal skins, and Susan, I do see your hand, I'll get to you in a second. The writing on animal skins is a relatively recent, meaning it's where we have a lot of it is like Common Era. Like the oldest complete Torah scroll is maybe like 1,000 years old or something like that. But the problem is, in the days of Egypt and in the days of ancient Israel, when they went to Har Sinai, what they were writing in was not animal skin. They were writing on papyrus. And I don't know how many of you have written on papyrus before, but the problem is papyrus doesn't last. So if the Torah scroll itself was written on papyrus and put in the Ark of the Covenant, and we found the Ark of the Covenant, there'd only be dust in there. So if there are other records and complete scrolls that are as old as the giving of the Torah, meaning about 3,000 or so years old, moving from 2021 to the year 1312, all of those scrolls would be long gone at this point. So the only thing that we have left is stone. So when I said there's a lot of mystery here, it's true. Now, if we found those papyrus scrolls, I don't think they would necessarily change the story. I think they would strengthen the evidence that the Torah itself would have been written in this ancient Phoenician-like script. It wasn't Phoenician. It was an Israeli script. It was an Israeli alphabet, but it was clearly connected to the Canaanite and Phoenician alphabets. And more importantly, it was different than the alphabet that we have today. Not wildly. They had an aleph, they had a bet, and as you'll see in one of the later charts, you can kind of trace the morphing of the letters, which there are people who just study this for a living, how letters change, or at least it's a specialty of theirs. But the problem is, anything that would have been written down on a scroll-like thing is long gone. And in terms of animal skins, things are much, much more recent. So if you want to know what was happening back when the Torah was given, all we have is stone and rocks. And I'll show you some really cool pictures of some other famous writings and inscriptions. That's all we still have to go on, other than handed down tradition. Susan, please.
Yeah, well, the Sumerians did this kind of writing cuneiform with clay tablets, and they would,
Yeah, those are the little
have a
chick chops
stylus.
and everything, the little
Yeah.
lines. So one of the questions is, I mean, that was pretty ancient, and that we know was really created for business purposes, trading between people, money, et cetera, like that. And the same thing, how much was that an ancient alphabet? How much was it mathematical? Again, there's a lot of muddy early history, but what we're really focusing on, because the Sumerian, which literally was lines up and down and left and right, which actually looked more like Chinese, if anything, is not connected directly to the alphabet that we know of. So if I didn't say that clearly before, I'll clarify myself. The idea of the alphabet, meaning alpha, beta, aleph, bet, A, B, C, that started around 3,300 years ago with Egyptian hieroglyphs that morphed into an ox, an alpha, a bite, a house. And again, ancient Egyptian, the words might have been slightly different, but not so in ancient Egyptian, a lot of words probably were similar to Canaanite words and then to Israelite words. A lot of these ancient cultures, their fundamental words for something Mayim were often connected, and that influenced that their alphabets that were built on fundamental pictures of fundamental ideas and concepts. Whereas the Sumerians, their alphabet did not directly influence what we call the Aleph Bet today. So thank you. If I don't know if I made that clear earlier, but that's a good clarification. There were other developing alphabets in the world, but they didn't directly influence what we have right now. Excellent. Thank you, Susan. So this is something I wanted to show you. It's really cool. So at the bottom, you have, one of the earliest forms of the alphabet. I'm actually trying to figure out which order it goes. Or it might start at number 1. Yeah, it's probably number 1 because it's not a complete alphabet. But you see here, actually, if you look at line number 1, the first letter there on the far right, a straight line with 2 little curves coming out of it. If you rotate that 90 degrees, then it's a flat line with 2 things coming up. It looks like an oxen head, the head with the 2 horns coming out. So in almost every alphabet from that point on, the oxen head, the alpha or the aleph, became that letter. It got turned on its side. And the second letter, meaning second from the right, which is the bet, is supposed to kind of look like a house. And in fact, in one of the very early, this isn't even the oldest alphabet, the Phoenician one, it even looks more like a house. The Vav, which they have there is, or where do they have there? The Vav, if you look in the Hebrew on the top, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in from the right on line 1. Vav is a hook. So it looks like a hook, and so on and so forth. Each of these letters means something. A yud, the letter yud is yad. So it kind of looks like a hand. But the question is, at what point did we get from line 1 to these letters at the top that we all know and love today and we learn in school? And even then, we've already changed it with cursive Hebrew and Rashi script and the script used inside of a Torah scroll, etc. So we have a big question mark here. We have ample evidence that the Torah was given, and in the first temple period, the first Beit HaMikdash, there are inscriptions in that ancient Hebrew script. When did it become the Hebrew that we know today? And this is the story both given by rabbis and scholars as well. In the year 586 to 539 before the Common Era, the northern kingdom of Israel, they had split into 2 kingdoms at this point. The northern kingdom, so we're many, many years after King David, was destroyed. And then in this year, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the southern kingdom, destroyed the temple, exiled the people, and left only a few scattered remains behind in the land of Israel. Now we have that famous song, that Tehillim, that psalm, by the rivers of Babylon, al Neharot Bavel, where we sat down, and we wept. Except if you actually went back in time to the Israelites living in Babylon during this exile in the southern kingdom, some of them were weeping for home, but a lot of them were doing fine. They were doing business. They were writing poetry, they were learning, and they were writing. And what letters were they writing in? This is where we believe, we think, can't 100% prove, but we think that the alphabet that they were using was the alphabet that we know today, or something very close to it, that people call either the Aramaic alphabet, Imperial Aramaic, but it's what the Babylonians were using. And when the Israelites spent, 70 years living there, they adopted this new alphabet. And then they come back under the Persian king Cyrus the Great. In the year 539, he sends them back, say, build your temple. They rebuild the second Beit HaMikdash. And this guy, Ezra the scribe, comes back. And one of the things that he starts to do is we've lost our tradition, we've lost our history, we stopped practicing a lot of our holidays like Sukkot, etc. And he says, we got to bring it back. And we're going to start publicly reading from a Torah scroll. We need to write down new Torah scrolls. We need to start propagating it. And the letters that people can read are not the ancient Hebrew. Some can, the scholars can, but most people, after 70 years, have grown up with what we would call modern Hebrew letters. So he says, let's start writing Torah scrolls and the ones people know. That would be like saying, nobody reads Hebrew today, so we're going to start making all of our Sidurim in phonetic English. And guess what? You walk in a Lake Park synagogue and on the shelf, 4 or 5 down from the top is a Sidur that has 3 lines, Hebrew, and then phonetic, like the word Asher would be A-S-H-E-R, and then a translation of it. So this idea of, look, we need to teach the Torah. People have forgotten it. They're not going to relearn an alphabet that no one has really used for 70 years. They all know this new alphabet. So we do that. And then we have archaeological evidence from this time that they were using the Imperial Aramaic, or what we'll just say simply, the modern Hebrew alphabet. And that makes a lot of sense. There was a total upheaval, a complete decimation of our society and our culture. And when we went back, we had lost a lot of, and this happened with speaking Hebrew. For people didn't speak Hebrew for hundreds and thousands of years. Eventually they spoke whatever they were locally, Arabic, Spanish. Eventually we'd speak German. And then we always made it a little Jewy, hence Yiddish. But in the modern state of Israel, nobody spoke Hebrew anymore. Scholars could write it. People could generally read it. No one spoke Hebrew. So come along Eliezer ben Yehuda, and he had to recreate the language pretty much from scratch. Same thing happened here with the letters. That's the story that many scholars agree with, and it lines up with tradition. And then we have here in the year 100 BCE, just a few hundred years after Ezra. It's a little hard to see, but this is an inscription outside of Yerushalayim. And it says, if you look really close, you can probably make out those letters. It says Hananiah. I don't remember the middle. It's like Ben something, or I don't remember the last name, Yerushalayim. And you can see in the bottom line, you can make out the mem. That's like our mem today. The yud is a little funny, but that's fine. They're carving in stone. Resh, vav, a shin we know today. So that, again, the inscriptions before the destruction of the first temple were in that ancient Hebrew. And then after the building of the second temple, even before the year 0, they were in modern Hebrew. So whatever the transition it happened in that time, around when Ezra would have brought us back. So I'm going to pause here for questions. Ken, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, a couple of things. Very, very quickly, that the destruction of the temple about 6 slides back did remind me of January 6th. It had the same artistic kind of feel for that. Now, I don't want to say anything
I'm not touching that. I'm not touching that one.
Okay.
Actually, I can't touch that one. That was a horrible destruction of democracy. It's one of the most evil things that happened. That's not, that I'll say. Yes,
but I think what the question I was asking myself, and I sort of came up with an answer, was when you said Ezra came back and people essentially weren't literate. And so he brought back, if I understand it correctly, the story, if you want, the history and the alphabet, and then he shared that with the nation. And so I was wondering how quickly people lose literacy and how quickly they can regain it. And I'm reminded of the recent history of Sequoyah and the Cherokees. He came up, he worked many years on it. He came up with his own syllabic, if you want, alphabet. And within a couple of years, because they had a printing press, and in a couple of years, 99% of the Cherokees were literate, could read, could write, and use that alphabet. So it can move rather quickly, though when you look back, it seems rather unbelievable that you go from a picture of an ox head to an olive. I mean,
Yeah.
so
I mean, again, there's a lot of mystery here, although again, we see in all languages this common trope, and it's pretty like those charts where they say it clearly went from here to here to here. I'm sure we missed some, you know, they actually talk about like the missing link with the development of the Hebrew alphabet. And we kind of do have a lot of stones and tablets that show those in between alphabets. But one of the interesting things here is this, and they'll show it on the next slide, is, you know, this is like the Kaddish thing. So actually tomorrow night is the yard site of my father, Alav Shalom, and I'll be, you know, going to a synagogue, and I'll be the Shiva actually, and I'll be saying Kaddish. And the language of the Kaddish is not in Hebrew, it's in Aramaic, because the Kaddish was put together when the popular language of the regular people was Aramaic. So when Ezra came back, but there were people, first of all, they obviously knew the Hebrew letters, and that's one of the things we've kind of kept. Ever since Ezra, we've always kept the Hebrew letters. We've either just been able to read them or use them phonetically for other languages, like, you know, Jewish Arabic, like where it was Arabic, but it was written in Hebrew letters. So that's an interesting thing. I don't know if it's unique only to the Jewish people, but it's a pretty cool thing about us. For several thousand years, no matter what language we spoke, we kept our lettering system, even though it changed at some point. But when Ezra came back, people knew the Paleo Hebrew. They knew that ancient alphabet, as I'll prove in a moment, but most people didn't. And they wanted to write it in a way that would be popular, that most people could read. And it's the equivalent, again, of English. You know, most American Jews today, I don't know if most, but I would guess that a significant, if not majority of American Jews can't read Hebrew. But if you wrote it in English letters, they'd be able to read it out. And the rabbis and the scholars at some point said, you know what? It's not about the letters, it's about them being able to understand the story and the language. And you even have evidence that Ezra, or at least a rabbinic source, said that Ezra said you could even write the Torah in Greek, not even just the letters, but in ancient Greek, because again, the letters themselves are not what's important, it's the word of God. Now today, and that's what I wanted to kind of emphasize, today the letters are sacrosanct. You can't touch the letters, except if someone says, Rabbi, in the Siddur, can I do the Amidah, the standing prayer, the Shemona Esrei? Can I just read it in English? The answer is yes. The rabbis say what's still more important is understanding what you're saying. But that doesn't mean the letters aren't sacred. And the rabbis say it's better to learn the letters. But the letters they're talking about are not the letters that probably were given when God gave the Torah. So again, here, Second Temple, we already see proof of the modern alphabet we know. But fast forward again, the Second Temple is destroyed. We're under the Romans, and it's really ultimately our fault that we were destroyed. There was internal strife, there were different sects, and not just Christianity, within the Jews fighting with each other. And at some point in history, oh, this is frozen. Oh, no, there it is. At some point in this part of history around the Romans, there was a series of scrolls. Most of them were just the Torah itself. Some of them were other texts known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's still some mystery about exactly who wrote them. Many say the Essenes wrote them, entirely possible regardless. The letters that they used to write it were mostly the modern Hebrew we know, except for these circled words. Those circled words are all the name of God, the Yud, the He, the Vav, and the He. And what letters are they written in? In the ancient Paleo Hebrew, in the ancient, Phoenician-like, Canaanite-like alphabet. So clearly, they still remember that alphabet. And when it came to the name of God, there was something special about that. And that may go down to, yes, ultimately you need to be able to read it and understand it. But when you want to get to the sacred name of God, you use the alphabet that you know was the one that God gave. So here's some strong evidence that we still maintain this alphabet, that it clearly predated modern Hebrew, and whoever wrote this thought that that alphabet was clearly the one that was closer to God, as it were, because why would you write the name of God or it makes more sense to write the name of God in the alphabet that you think it was originally given in, and the rest that's less important, it is less important, you write in the alphabet that everyone can recognize. So this is this is around the 2nd century of the Common Era. Which, is the year, 100-ish, something like that. So not that long ago. And this is extremely strong evidence, again, that they remembered the alphabet and that this Paleo-Hebrew alphabet clearly predated the alphabet that we have today. So before we shift to the second part of the class, any questions up until now? Yeah, Ken, please.
Out of curiosity, in the first line after the break, could you read any of that to us? Do you recognize where this is from?
So one of the, could I figure out where this is? One of the issues is it's blurry. I mean, I think I see the word Elokim, Eshtachave, El, Mul, bowing towards. I could probably figure it out. I see the word al, but again, I mean, the alphabet has changed with printing and everything like that. But no, I don't know. And also, a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls are not the 5 books. A lot of them could be from the book of Isaiah, actually. Le David. No, I'm not sure. Again, I could probably sit here and figure out enough.
Oh, you mean
words.
Le David? Okay, the first word after the break looks like Le David.
It could be Tehillim. The whole, it'd be a fun thing, you know, if I remember, I'll go back, I see the word Eretz, but the fact that I can so easily pick out words, if I have an app on my phone where I could probably type in 3 or 4 of these words and it'll tell me exactly where it comes from. But some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I think this is from the Torah or the Tanakh, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls are texts that are separate, are not the Tanakh. They're like a history of some war or something like that may or may not have happened. So I'm not entirely certain where this is from. I'd have to sit there and break it down. But regardless, this is pretty much consistent through the Dead Sea Scrolls. They went back to the original alphabet when they came to the name of God. All right, so Shelly, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. So this section is long, so I may split it up. But a lot of this comes back to, well, Rabbi, this all seems very academic, et cetera, like that. Where are the original sources that back up the idea that the alphabet has changed? It sounds like a lot of kfira and heresy. Well, no, this conversation started in the Talmud, and the Talmud itself did not resolve the history of it. So in the Talmud, in the section of Sanhedrin, the rabbis were clearly aware of these multiple alphabets, and very likely that many of the rabbis could sit down and write and read them. When I was in Israel in yeshiva, there was one day that I just was really bored. So I taught myself Paleo-Hebrew. I basically taught myself the Phoenician alphabet, which basically translated over to the Paleo-Hebrew, but I'm sure these rabbis could read it explicitly. So Shelly, go ahead, start in the Talmud. Mar Zutra says.
Mar Zutra says, and some say that it is Mar Ukva who says, initially the Torah was given to the Jewish people in Ivrit script.
So
The
Ivrit
original-
script, sorry, I was just gonna, now I'm
No,
gonna
no.
clarify it. Ivrit script, or Ktav Ivri, that is the ancient Phoenician-like Paleo-Hebrew. So when it's confusing because it's the word Ivrit means Hebrew, but they don't mean modern Hebrew. They mean ancient Hebrews, ancient Israelite. So Ivrit script means that old alphabet that's much closer to the Canaanite Phoenician script. Please continue.
That's the one that you showed us. The first was Phoenician, and then the Ktav Ivrit, and then the
reality is that the Ktav Ivri and Phoenician script are basically, I don't want to say indistinguishable, but they're basically exactly the same. If you can read one, you can pretty much read the other.
Okay.
Academics will call it Paleo-Hebrew. We could use that phrase. Sorry, go ahead. The original form.
That's okay. Okay. The original form of the written language and the sacred tongue Hebrew. It was given to them again in the days of Ezra in Ashurit script and the Aramaic tongue.
So that is when I say, where do you get this history that Ezra, not only do we have a lot of archaeological evidence to show that the language shifted or the letters shifted then, but it says it here in the Talmud. The rabbis knew what they were talking about. This is almost like a historical analysis. This is like a really academic conversation. It touches on theological themes. It's quite academic. So they say that in the time of Ezra, after they came back, after the Babylonians kicked him out of the southern kingdom, they came back, and Ezra introduced the Torah. He didn't create an alphabet. He gave them the Torah in this alphabet that they had gotten from the Babylonians that the rabbis call the Assyrian script. Now, was it the letters that the Assyrians were using? Probably not. This is where the rabbis lack certain historical things about exactly who that alphabet was. It probably was the imperial Aramaic alphabet. Again, this is where you get into academic distinctions, but the rabbis call the alphabet that we recognize today, here printed on the right of the page, they call that Ktav Ashuri or Assyrian script. That's what they call the alphabet that we know today. Please.
The Jewish people selected Ashurit script and the sacred tongue for the Torah scroll and left Ivrit script and the Aramaic tongue for the commoners. The Gemara asks, who are these commoners? Rav Hista said, the Samaritans, Kutim. The Gemara asks, what is Ivrit script? Rav Hista says, Libonaz script.
This is a fascinating, this is like a quick line that they throw away, but there's so much going on here. These Samaritans, which are people living near ancient Israel, that to this day have kept many of the ancient practices of the Israelites, and in many ways they might claim that they are the descendants of ancient Israel. They still write their sacred text, which is version of the Bible. They write it in that Paleo-Hebrew. So that's what they're saying here. The commoners kept that ancient alphabet. Now there's a question then, if they kept it, why didn't we keep it? And this is where we get into the realm of hypothesis. The hypothesis is that because the Samaritans were claiming to be the descendants of ancient Israel, and they were using that ancient script, the rabbis, or at least the scholars at the time, wanted to make a distinction between the two peoples and say, they're not us. We're using a different alphabet. It may not be the original one, but we want nothing to do with the Samaritans. Not that we despise them, but we want to make very clear they are a separate religion with a separate language, a separate alphabet, but the true Torah of God, we're only going to write in these letters. Now, we don't have a lot of evidence for that. It makes sense, and there are many who have put that forward academically, but again, it's really hard to prove that. But again, it makes sense because the Samaritans around the same time were writing their sacred text in our ancient alphabet, and around the same time, why didn't we do the same? And again, the hypothesis is we wanted to make sure that everyone knew we're not them, but we don't know. Regardless, the rabbis were aware of this. We did this and they kept that. So maybe the rabbis were leaving something out, we're not sure. But Shelley, you're doing a great job. If you want to, and the Libona script again is, we're not sure exactly what that is, whether it's they thought Lebanese or Lebanon, or, but whatever it is, it's whatever alphabet they were using, and it was different than ours. We used a different alphabet, even though we knew about, the rabbis knew about that ancient alphabet. So go ahead, please, Shelley.
And the writing of the letter, Hanish Devan, was written in the Aramaic script and set forth in the Aramaic tongue. And
This is just, they're bringing verses from the text about that development of the language, how Ezra himself writes about the change, the shift in the letters and the language. So again, we have explicit evidence of that. Please continue. Susan, I'll get to you in just a second. Go ahead, Shelley.
The term Hanish Devan is similar to the word Nishtana, meaning changed, alluding to the fact that the script had been changed. And it is written with regard to the writing on the wall of Belshazzar's palace. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing nor make known to the king the interpretation, from Daniel. And the reason they could not read it is that it was written in the new script that Ezra would transmit. And it is written that he shall write for himself a second Mishneh Torah, where second or Mishnah teaches that it is written in a script that is apt to be changed. Lehishtanot.
So pause there for a moment. So what they're doing here, they do this often in the Talmud, is there any evidence in the text even hinting at the idea that the language changed? So they actually have, we have archaeological proof for this, so we can show that it changed, but they're saying is they knew that there were multiple alphabets, and they said that there any hint in the text. So Ezra's talking about some letter that's being written, and the word for it, Hanish Devan, looks like the word like Manishana. What's different here? So they say it's a hint that this letter, and again, it's probably not at all what it's talking about, but it's a hint at it. It's a word play. This letter has the word that looks like change, therefore the letters change. So it's a pun in a lot of ways. And the book of Dvarim talks about a king writing his own personal Torah, a second Torah for himself, and the word Mishneh, a second one. And again, he kind of explains it as that when the king came back in the second temple, they couldn't read the ancient alphabet. So they needed to write a second one, an alphabet that they knew, a changed one. So again, all of these hints and puns and plays on words. Susan, please.
Yeah, Lebanon is where Phoenicians lived. The ancient Phoenicia is now modern Lebanon. So that makes sense that they would have called it.
Yeah.
Well, that's not visible anymore, but Lebanon. Makes sense.
And that makes perfect sense. It's the script that came from that part of the world. It's likely not necessarily a corruption. it's something that, we're not sure what they're referring to. Regardless, they're talking about some ancient culture nation where they used X version of an alphabet, and now, we changed from there. So Gloria and Leonard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Thank you, Shelley. We'll shift over here as we come to the next part of the Baraita, this ancient Mishnaic source. So Gloria, please, the Baraita continues.
Why is this script called Asherit? Because it ascended with the Jewish people from Ashur when they returned from their exile in Babylonia.
Which again, we have a lot of historical proof for. And again, whether these names and words directly connect to what the people themselves, the Babylonians, may have not have called it the Assyrian script. They may have called it the Aramaic, Imperial Aramaic alphabet. Regardless, the theory, the hypothesis, and a lot of evidence shows that they took it with them from Babylonia. It was the popular alphabet there. So then it continues on. Please, Gloria, it is taught in a Baraita.
Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, initially the Torah was given to the Jewish people in this script, Asherit, which is in use today. Once the Jewish people sinned, it turned into an impairment for them, and they began writing with a different script, Libona.
Or that Paleo-Hebrew, that Phoenician-like script.
Once they repented, the first script was returned to them, and they resumed writing with Asherit script, as it is stated. Return to the stronghold, you prisoners of hope. Even today do I declare that I will render double Mishneh unto you. Meaning that God restored to the Jewish people this script that had been changed, Nishtana. The Baraita continues, if this script predates the exile to Babylonia, why is it called Asherit? Because it is
Me'usheret.
beautiful and straight in script.
So the mystical Kabbalists probably love this because it says that the letters that God gave down from heaven were the letters that we have today. And then the people sinned, so God took those letters away and introduced the new Paleo-Hebrew. And then when we came back, we got that original alphabet. But why would we call it Assyrian? When we got it from a land that we called Assyria, which was conquered by the Babylonians, why would we called it that because we got it from there? No, because it was the shape of the letters. So this middle one maintains, what this middle one does is allows for the letters that Ezra and the letters that we use today, that the Talmud would have been written in, to have a certain sacredness. But it really doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's really a stretch. And even their little pun here on the verse from Zechariah on Mishneh and the letters changed, it's even weaker than the puns from the first source. Now, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who put together the Mishnah, is a great authority. So holding by this belief is absolutely strong. But again, we have a Talmudic source that debates this that makes sense, and there's ample archaeological evidence for. So it's really hard to argue that this middle one makes any sense, that we had, art scroll letters, and then God took them away, and then God gave them back. And the fact that we called that the Assyrian alphabet, as opposed to the fact that we had gotten it from Assyria, was, again, another pun because they were me'usheret, they were straight lines. Again, it's really a stretch there. But we're not done stretching at this point. So Leonard, if you would continue, the Baraita continues. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar.
Baraita continues. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says in the name of Rabbi Eliezer ben Baraita.
Hamodai.
Wait, not yet.
Who said in
Oh, sorry, Rabbi Eliezer ben Parata.
Yeah.
the name of Rabbi
Trying to save me some time.
Oda. This script did not change at all, as it is stated with regard to the construction of the tabernacle. The books of Bavai, the Poles, Exodus 27:10, thus teaches that just as the poles were not changed, so too the books,
The hooks.
rather, Vahim, were not changed. The letter Vav in Asherit script has the shape of a book.
Of a hook.
Of a hook, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Evidently, this is why the term for hook in the Torah is Vav. And the verse states, quote, and to the Jews according to the script, and according to their language. Esther 8:9. Thus, this teaches us that just as their language was not changed over the generations, but remained Hebrew, so too their script was not changed.
Excellent, thank you. So this first part of this opinion in the name of three different rabbis, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, a lot of Aleph Lamed Zayins there, as you can appreciate. Again, it's kind of a weak derivation because of this thing describing the Mishkan with Vav, which again, in the ancient language, a Vav is a hook, and the letter Vav in Hebrew looks like a hook. It actually looks like a hook in modern Hebrew and the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, but they're claiming is because it's both a Vav in all the different languages, the letters, the alphabet did not change. Now, again, it's hard to understand what they're even saying here, that they, what does it mean that they kept it? So you'd have to, break this down a little bit more. But one thing here they bring at the end is they say in the book of Esther, it says, the Jews according to their script and according to their language. So the assumption is this is the language and letters that they've always had. And I think this is essentially a rejection of Paleo-Hebrew entirely. There is no Paleo-Hebrew. It's always been the letters that we have today. Now, just because she says according to their language in Hebrew, if someone came to anybody today and said, what's the Jewish language and the Jewish alphabet, they would say, it's this alphabet, and they would show it today. Just because in 2021 would say this is the Hebrew alphabet, no one's going to claim that that's the same alphabet that we've had for thousands of years. That's just the way people talk. In the time of Esther, the Jewish alphabet was a certain version. She did not say, and the alphabet that has been there since Moshe wrote the Torah, since God handed it down. She just said according to what their alphabet and their language is at her time. So again, this one is even more of a stretch. At least the middle opinion about it changing back and forth can kind of explain why there are two alphabets existing. To deny the existence of that first alphabet, it doesn't fit at all. So what we can actually do, I'm actually going to scroll down and then go back, is we can look at a quick summary of what we've seen so far, the three opinions. So the first one, Rav Zutra, Rav Yossi, the Torah was given in Ketav Ifri and turned to Ketav Ashuri in the time of Ezra. That both has, so that's a classical source. It has ample evidence. It makes perfect sense. And personally, I do think it's correct. The second one, Rebbe, who compiled the Mishnah, so he has a lot of weight and brilliance, said it was given in this Assyrian script, this ancient Hebrew, was forgotten or taken away because of their sins. And they used this Paleo-Hebrew until Ezra brought it back. And again, there's a lot of evidence against that, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. And the fact that people called it Assyrian script because it was Meusheret blocky, again, it's almost beyond a stretch. And Rabbi Elazar Hamodai, that the Torah was always an Ashuri, we just know we really have so much evidence that is not true, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they clearly remembered those ancient letters. Now, are 2 and 3 completely invalid and not part of our tradition? Of course they are. And what you actually have over the next several 100,000 years are the rabbis debating this back and forth. There's no consensus. But one of the things they start to do is they start to play with, let's make a distinction here between the Torah, like the book of Bamidbar and the Song of Moshe, and the 10 Commandments, the actual tablets. Maybe the tablets were written in one letter and the rest of the Torah is written in a different alphabet. So they're trying to find a balance between all of these opinions, really probably the one of Rebbe. How is it that we've gone back and forth with the lettering? Well, originally the Torah, writ large, was given in 2 alphabets. And, we kind of shift back and forth. Now, again, there's really no evidence. Well, we don't have the 10 Commandments. We don't have the tablets. We don't know what was written on them. But again, there's far more evidence for the first opinion, both the fact that it's an opinion in the Talmud and ample historical evidence, and it makes way more sense than the other opinions. But this last thing we'll look at and then open it up for questions. Again, this chart specifically is the development of Hebrew that we know today. So you go back to, again, we said at the very beginning, there wasn't really a concept of letters. It was pictures that would represent a story that you could read, but not phonetically. Eventually, alphabets became phonetic. And the meaning of the letters, meaning Aleph, the ox head, when you see it, it meant someone who powerful or literally an ox. That meaning slowly floated away. And all that mattered was you would look at the symbols, you know what the sounds are, and you would know Abba means dad, because spoken language came first, and you needed some way to write it down. So by Paleo-Hebrew, these symbols, which they probably remembered that the letter Yud is a yod or an arm, et cetera, they started to lose that meaning. Then this Paleo-Hebrew eventually shifts into what we call Ktav Ivri. This, the second line from the top, is, we don't know for certain, but it's likely the one that they were probably writing their ancient scriptures in. If you had to guess, based on ample evidence, what Moshe and Joshua and Isaiah would have been using, it was probably that second line. Now, eventually, it started shifting when they came back in the time of the Second Temple under Ezra, and that third line, where it says TEM, temple, now that still doesn't look 100% like our modern language, but pretty clearly. Look at the second to last line. It's a letter shin. It looks like a shin. To the right, it has the resh, the kuf, etc. That's with a few exceptions, like the tzadi looks different here, but for the most part, this is the Assyrian, Babylonian, Imperial Aramaic army that we have today. And then eventually it morphs into this Assyrian script that we know. That's the fourth line from the top, the DSS. And even though, again, it's a little bit different, the Dalet obviously looks different, that's pretty much the alphabet we know. And then eventually it just starts shifting and shifting. And here's where things get really interesting is once we start writing it down, you start getting calligraphy. And eventually, thousands of years later, you get publishers. And then you have the letters that we use to write the Torah script. Like if you look third line from the bottom, those letters are the ones we use in a Torah scroll today. But if you're writing a book with those letters, and then you want to write a comment on the side saying, you know, some commentary, you want to use different letters so people know it's not part of the original text. So the fourth line from the bottom on the right that says RSH, Rashi script. Now, what a lot of people think is that the great Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki in Spain, was writing in those letters. No, he wasn't. He was writing the same letters as the text of the Torah. But when they decided to publish it, they wanted to make sure, the publisher wanted to make a distinction between the text of the Torah and the commentary by the great Rabbi Rashi. So they created this calligraphic, it was a Spanish type, font type. Like when you are a computer, you have Helvetica, Times New Roman, etc., and use different fonts to represent different things. That's Rashi script. Rashi probably wouldn't be able to read Rashi script. I don't know if that's 100% true, but he did not create it. And again, throughout time, you had different publishers and people who wanted to get creative and beautiful. The Torah scrolls that we have today, those letters are relatively speaking, I mean, at this point, they're at least 1,000 years old, but relatively speaking, they're pretty young. Why do they look that way? Because the rabbis had to decide on a specific set of rules so that every Torah scroll would be the same. And they have multiple alphabets and they voted on this one. And that's been the one that's been passed down for a long, long time. But we know that there are many variations of it. And if I'm not writing a Torah scroll, I can write any version I want as long as others can read it. So we see second from the bottom, modern Hebrew, which again, it's still, there's like 50 variations on it. And then the bottom one, cursive Hebrew, which I think it's really cool. The letter Aleph, and this is the far right bottom line, the letter Aleph in Hebrew cursive looks a lot more like the Paleo-Hebrew, the ancient Aleph of old. So in some ways, it's, you know, kind of come full circle. It has the little horns and, you know, the flat head there. But we keep reinventing alphabets. And that's kind of the point of the early rabbis in Ezra, which is it's not about the letters, it's about what they say. Now, does that undermine the mystical Kabbalists that say the shape of the letters, literally God came down from heaven, opened, you know, the Birnbaum Siddur, the Machzor, and pulled out the letters, and that's how God created the universe? It does bring a big challenge to that. And that's why that second middle opinion in the Talmud, that the original letters were the ones we all know and love today, it supports that. But again, there's very little evidence for that. And there's far more both Talmudic evidence, archaeological evidence, and just good old common sense that the alphabet changed. But even though the alphabet changed, so much of what it said and the message and the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls are so ancient and they're basically the same as the Torah we have today, that's what's really important. There are changes, there are mistakes here and there, especially when you're copying from one alphabet to the other. But the Torah that we know and love is at the very least at 13, you know, from the year 1312 BCE. And even if scholars say it's a little bit later, there's no question the Torah is ancient. And regardless of the alphabet it's written in, God's word and the history of our people and our meaning and our mission on earth, that is ancient. however we say it and write it.